a record-breaking earthquake followed by a tsunami that crashed over Japan and left nuclear reactors broken and leaking radioactivity into the atmosphere. Apart from the immediate damage, the disaster also reignited a global debate on the virtues and dangers of nuclear fuel. Hello and welcome to Environment, which this week is visiting one of France's 58 nuclear reactors, one that has borne the brunt of nature before after it was struck by a storm 12 years ago. Then the worst was avoided and extra safety measures have been put in place since. But with 20% of the world's working power plants lying on fault lines, how safe can nuclear ever be? With no CO2 emissions, nuclear power has been promoted as a clean energy. We'll be asking environmentalists who long supported this view what they have to say now. Before finally looking at the long-term health effects of nuclear accidents. You'll meet a woman who was just a fetus when Chernobyl exploded, but is part of the rise in cancers that came in the wake of that disaster. Well, I'm now inside the secure zone of this nuclear reactor site. It's a no-fly area and ships are kept at a controlled distance. Indeed, this dam on which I'm walking is also regularly maintained. But after events in Japan, fears over the safety of nuclear fuel have once again arisen. We're going to take a close look now at all the preparations that are taken and how safe nuclear fuel can really be. Total silence, complete concentration in a control room that isn't even real. This is an exact copy of the control centre in Blayai's nuclear reactors, a simulation room used to train technicians and plan for any possible disaster.
We're now at 80 millibars, so we no longer need the CD1J. It's done, so we need to shut it down.
The men and women who drive the reactors here are given refresher training courses and their reactions are tested every year. Security measures to avoid human error, but the plants themselves are also constantly being updated.
In order to increase security, we have added systems that were not in the original design. We have added a hydrogen recombiner that, even without an electrical feed, can consume the hydrogen that would build up if we had a bad accident. It could, if left to accumulate, cause an explosion.
In a nuclear reactor, when systems fail, overheating of fuel rods creates a buildup of hydrogen, which is highly combustible. This is what led to the explosions in Japan. At Blayais, they've already felt the wrath of nature when a storm crashed over their dam and flooded part of the plant. It's been strengthened since, but for Patrice Lapouge, nature has the power to overrule man's best laid plans. And with its 58 reactors, for him, France is a frightening place to live.
Take a look at the map of France and how it's been destroyed. They've built power plants on main waterways. That's seriously worrying because the river will rise up again. It's happening across the board. A plane could crash into any of the nuclear waste pools at these reactors, and we'd have a Japanese-scale disaster.
The answer from the maker of nuclear reactors, the third generation of power plants, complete with 2 reinforced shells protecting the core reactor. They will, constructors claim, withstand earthquakes, plane crashes, and will be ready to deal with the worst-case scenario, a complete meltdown of the radioactive core.
Of its own volition, without any outside intervention, the melted core would pass into this zone, where it would melt iron doors, allowing the huge reservoirs of water to cool the core and solidify it. When it's solid, it doesn't move and doesn't release any radioactivity to the outside.
S'il est solide, il ne bougera pas et il n'émettra pas de radioactivité à l'extérieur.
The world's first third-generation power plant is currently under construction in Finland, a project that is already 2 years behind schedule and at least 50% over budget. Delays first arose when the foundation of the reactor building was found to be too porous and prone to corrosion. The EPR is being built by 2 companies, owned mainly by the French government, Areva, which brings in annual revenues of 9 billion, and EDF, which had sales of 65 billion euros last year. For many ecologists, these vast sums aren't ensuring security.
The real problem is that economic interests are weighed against security. I think many French people would remember the report from the former CEO of EDF, which recommended modifying the status of the country's nuclear watchdog, as it was starting to make life difficult for the energy companies.
France is the world's second largest producer of atomic energy, which supplies almost 80% of the country's electricity, a power it doesn't plan on giving up. Well, while many of those living in the village surrounding that nuclear reactor have somewhat accepted its presence, stocking iodine tablets in case of an emergency, and accepting the financial input the power plant can have, the ecological debate rages on. Atomic energy can help countries reduce their CO2 emissions. Indeed, for example, it's estimated that without it, the UK's carbon footprint would be 5 to 12% bigger. Some environmentalists promote it as the future of clean energy, a somewhat explosive idea.
Bruno Combi and Anne Branco are both proud environmentalists, and yet they're in complete disagreement. They're at odds over the question of nuclear energy.
An environmentalist is someone who respects themselves and those around them and nature in general. So you see, it doesn't have anything to do with being pro or anti one form of energy or another. Energy is a solution, and objectively, nuclear energy presents many advantages.
I don't think there really are any pro-nuclear environmentalists. There's been a trend of saying that maybe nuclear energy could actually solve global warming. But most experts and environmental groups agreed that this is not the solution. Moderation, efficiency, and renewable energy. Combined, that's plenty enough to replace nuclear energy within 5 to 10 years.
Renewable energy where it works is very welcome, but these technologies produce very little energy in sharp contrast with nuclear energy. Because of this, renewable energy structures end up taking up a lot of space, and that costs a lot. It's not about destroying the environment like with oil or coal. Nuclear waste is contained. Since there's very little of it, it's easy to stock it for decades, or even centuries.
The French government has been working on this problem for a while. It's now planning to bury the waste near the town of Bure, even though it's well known that this spot isn't geologically sound. This waste will remain radioactive for tens of thousands of years.
When the Chernobyl power plant exploded back in 1986, it contaminated an estimated 120,000 square kilometres of land. Contaminating land and air had, of course, its health consequences. According to UN figures, the accident resulted in 4,000 deaths. It also led to an increase in cancers, with children, even those that were still in the womb at the time of the explosion, proving the most vulnerable.
Christina has met with more than her fair share of doctors. This young woman was diagnosed with cancer of the thyroid when she was just 17. Thyroid cancer is almost unheard of among young people, but doctors in Corsica were quick to spot the problem.
I had difficulty breathing at night and swallowing when I was eating, so it was really quite annoying.
When Chernobyl struck, Christina was just a fetus in her mother's womb. She's convinced that her cancer, now in remission, was caused by the nuclear accident. Dr. Fauconnier agrees.
The thyroid is an organ that needs to accumulate iodine to produce thyroid hormones required for normal bodily functions. When there's radioactive iodine in the environment, it goes straight to the thyroid and irradiates it.
He says authorities were too slow to warn the population, so people continued to eat local products that may have been dangerous. The radiation is estimated to have hung in the air and spread through the soils for some 2 months after the nuclear accident. The environment is now free of its effects.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you again next time.